The dust had barely settled on Thomas Franklin Carver's grave when his 7 children began to realize their mother wasn't coming back from wherever grief had taken her mind. Franklin Carver stood at the kitchen window of his ranch house outside San Diego, California, watching the November sun sink toward the Pacific horizon in 1878, his calloused hands gripping the edge of the basin so hard his knuckles had gone white. Behind him, 3-year-old Samuel was crying again, the sound mixing with the clatter of dishes as 14-year-old Emma tried to manage supper, while simultaneously stopping 6-year-old twins, Ruth and Rebecca, from tracking mud across the floor she had scrubbed that morning. Somewhere upstairs, 8-year-old Daniel was supposed to be helping 10-year-old Lucy with her arithmetic, but Franklin could hear them arguing instead, their voices sharp with the kind of irritation that came from children forced to grow up too fast. 12-year-old James sat silent at the table, his young face already carrying the weight of trying to be the man his older brother Thomas had been before the horse accident 3 months ago that had shattered all their lives. Franklin turned from the window, his weathered face showing every one of his 42 years, plus a dozen more. Thomas had been 19, strong as an ox, with his whole life spread out before him like the California grasslands. One moment, he had been breaking a new stallion in the corral. The next, he was on the ground, with his neck bent at an angle that made Franklin's stomach turn even now in memory. His wife Clara had held their firstborn son as he took his last breaths, and something in her had broken beyond repair. She had lasted another month before the fever took her, but Franklin knew the truth. Clara had simply stopped fighting to stay alive. The doctor had called it pneumonia, but Franklin called it a shattered heart. "Papa, Samuel won't stop crying, and I cannot get him to eat anything," Emma said, her voice cracking with exhaustion. His eldest daughter had her mother's dark hair and delicate features, but there were shadows under her eyes that no 14-year-old should carry. Franklin crossed the kitchen and scooped Samuel into his arms, feeling the boy's hot tears soak into his shirt. "Hush now, little man, hush now." But his words felt hollow. What comfort could he offer when his own chest felt like it had a gaping hole where his heart used to be? The next morning, Franklin rode into San Diego with a list of supplies and a soul-deep weariness that made every movement feel like pushing through deep water. The town had grown considerably since he had first arrived in California 20 years ago, drawn by the promise of land and opportunity. The streets bustled with activity freight wagons, horsemen, women in their long skirts and bonnets, Chinese laborers heading to the docks, Mexican vaqueros in their distinctive dress. The war had been over for more than a decade, and California was thriving, but Franklin felt disconnected from all of it, like he was watching life through a thick pane of glass. He tied his horse outside Morrison's general store and stepped inside, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the dimmer interior. The store smelled of coffee, leather, and the sweet scent of stick candy that would have delighted his younger children if he had brought them along. But managing all 7 in town was beyond him now, and Emma had stayed home to watch them with James's help. "Franklin," Harold Morrison called from behind the counter, his round face creasing with sympathy. "How are you holding up?" "Managing," Franklin said shortly, pulling the list from his pocket. He didn't want sympathy. Sympathy made the grief rise up in his throat until he could barely breathe. As Morrison gathered the supplies, Franklin heard a commotion outside raised voices, one of them distinctly female and filled with distress. He stepped back out onto the wooden sidewalk to see a small crowd gathered around a wagon, where a woman in a dark dress was arguing with a heavy-set man in an expensive suit. "I have paid you every month for the past year, Mr. Henderson," the woman was saying, her voice shaking but firm. "The rent is not due for another 2 weeks. "Your rent was contingent on you maintaining the property as a boarding house," Henderson replied coldly. "You haven't had a single boarder in 3 months, Mrs. Murphy. The property is losing value. I want you out by the end of the week." "I have nowhere to go," the woman said, and Franklin could hear the desperation creeping into her voice. "Please, just give me until the new year. I will find boarders, I promise." "The end of the week, Mrs. Murphy. That is my final word." Henderson turned and walked away, leaving the woman standing by her wagon, her shoulders shaking. The crowd began to disperse, people uncomfortable with witnessing such distress. Franklin should have turned back into the store. He had more than enough troubles of his own, but something about the woman's straight-backed posture, despite her obvious despair, reminded him of Clara in her prouder days, before grief had bent her low. He found himself walking toward her. "Pardon me, madam. I could not help but overhear," Is there anything I might do to help?" The woman turned, and Franklin saw a face that might have been beautiful if it wasn't so drawn with sorrow. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun and brown eyes that held a familiar haunted look. "Unless you need a place to board or know someone who does, I fear there is nothing anyone can do, but I thank you for your kindness." "Franklin Carver," he said, tipping his hat. "I have a ranch about 5 miles outside town. What sort of boarding house did you run?" "Margaret Murphy," she replied, her voice steadying slightly as she fell back on practiced courtesy. "I took in miners and ranch hands mostly, provided meals and laundry. My husband ran the house with me before he passed 2 years ago. After he died, I managed well enough for a time, but this past year has been difficult." Franklin noticed she wore black, the deep mourning color, though if her husband had been dead 2 years, she might have moved to half mourning by now. "You have been alone this whole time?" Something flickered across Margaret's face, pain so sharp it made Franklin's own grief echo in response. "I had my daughter, Emily. She was 9 years old, the brightest, sweetest child. She died of scarlet fever last December. After that, I found it hard to keep up with everything. The boarders left one by one, and I could not seem to find the energy to seek new ones. I have been living on my savings, but Mr. Henderson is right that the house is empty now, except for myself." Franklin understood immediately. She was like Clara had been, like he himself felt most days, going through the motions of living without really being alive. "Mrs. Murphy, I find myself in need of help. I have 7 children at home, ages 3 to 14. My eldest son died 3 months ago, and my wife passed a month after him. My daughter Emma is trying to manage the household, but it is too much for a 14-year-old girl. I came to town today intending to post a notice for a housekeeper, but I wonder if you might be interested in the position." Margaret's eyes widened. 7 children? "Mr. Carver, I do not know if I am capable of managing such a large household in my current state." "Truth be told, the household is barely being managed at all right now," Franklin admitted. "I can pay you fair wages plus room and board. The work would be hard. I will not lie about that. But you would have a roof over your head and purpose to your days. And perhaps we could help each other, 2 people who understand what it is to lose the most precious thing in the world." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "You lost a child too. I can see it in your eyes, that particular kind of grief. My boy Thomas, he was 19. It does not matter how old they are still your child." "No, it does not matter at all," Margaret agreed softly. "Very well, Mr. Carver, I accept your offer. When would you like me to start?" "Can you be ready to leave town in an hour? I can help you load whatever you need to bring." "I have very little left. Most of it is already in my wagon. I was preparing to move out before Mr. Henderson even confronted me today. I knew I could not make the rent much longer." They worked together to finish loading her meager possessions, a trunk of clothes, some kitchen items, a rocking chair, and a small wooden box that she handled with such tenderness that Franklin knew it must contain memories of her daughter. He collected his supplies from Morrison's, ignoring the storekeeper's curious looks, and within the hour they were heading east out of San Diego toward his ranch. The ride was mostly quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Franklin found himself studying Margaret from the corner of his eye. She sat straight on the wagon seat, her hands competent on the reins of her own wagon that followed behind his. She had a quiet strength about her, the kind that came from enduring terrible things and surviving them. "Tell me about your children," Margaret said finally as the ranch house came into view, a sprawling adobe structure with a red tile roof that glowed golden in the afternoon sun. "I should know something about them before I meet them." Franklin took a breath, organizing his thoughts. Emma is the eldest now at 14. She has been trying to be her mother, but she is still just a girl herself. Then there is James, who is 12. He has been too quiet since his brother died. They were close. Lucy is 10, smart as a whip with numbers. Daniel is 8 and full of energy he does not know what to do with. The twins, Ruth and Rebecca, are 6 years old and identical. You will not be able to tell them apart for weeks, I wager. And then there is Samuel, who just turned 3. He cries a lot. He wants his mother and does not understand why she is not coming back. That must be so hard for all of them. And for you. Margaret's voice was gentle. Some days I do not know how we get through. I have the ranch to run, cattle to manage, hands to oversee. I cannot be everywhere at once. Emma has been doing her best, but I can see it wearing her down. She should be worrying about what dress to wear to the church social, not whether her baby brother has eaten enough, or if there is flour left for biscuits. As they pulled up to the house, children began spilling out the front door. Emma appeared first, her face confused and wary at the sight of a strange woman. James followed, his expression carefully neutral. The twins peered around Emma's skirts while Daniel came running up, his shirt untucked and his face dirty. "Papa, you are home. Did you bring candy?" "Daniel, mind your manners," Franklin said, climbing down from his horse. "Children, this is Mrs. Murphy. She's going to be staying with us and helping with the household. I expect you to treat her with respect and courtesy." Emma's face had gone carefully blank, and Franklin's heart sank. He should have prepared her, should have told her what he was planning. "Emma, may I speak with you inside?" His daughter nodded stiffly and turned back into the house. Franklin glanced at Margaret apologetically. "James, help Mrs. Murphy unload her wagon, please. Show her to the spare room next to Emma's." He found Emma in the kitchen, her back rigid as she stared out the window. "You brought home a stranger to replace Mama." "Emma, no, that is not what this is." Franklin crossed to her, putting his hands on her shoulders. She was tall for her age, almost to his chin now. When had that happened? "Your mother could never be replaced. But sweetheart, you cannot keep doing all this alone. It is not fair to you. I can manage, Papa. I have been managing. I know you have, and you have done a better job than I had any right to expect. But Emma, you should have time to be young, to spend time with friends, to read your books, to not have to worry constantly about keeping 7 people fed and clothed and cared for." Emma's shoulders began to shake, and Franklin realized she was crying silently. "I am scared that if I stop trying to be Mama, I will forget her. I am already starting to forget what her voice sounded like." Franklin pulled his daughter into his arms, feeling his own eyes sting. "You will never forget her. She is part of you, part of all of us. But Emma, your mother would not want you to sacrifice your whole life trying to fill her shoes. She would want you to live, to be happy." "How can any of us be happy again?" Emma whispered against his chest. Franklin had no answer for that. He just held his daughter until her tears subsided, then gently wiped her face with his handkerchief. "Mrs. Murphy lost her daughter last year, her only child. She understands what we are going through. Give her a chance, sweetheart. For me." Emma nodded reluctantly and went to wash her face at the basin. Franklin returned outside to find Margaret directing James and Daniel as they carried her trunk into the house, the rocking chair already on the porch. Samuel had attached himself to Margaret's skirt, peering up at her with wide, curious eyes. "And who is this little man?" Margaret asked, her voice soft. "That is Samuel," Franklin said. "Samuel, this is Mrs. Murphy." "Mama?" Samuel asked hopefully, and Franklin felt his heart crack. "No, sweetheart, I am not your mama," Margaret said gently, crouching down to Samuel's level. "But I am going to be staying here and helping take care of you. Would that be all right?" Samuel studied her with serious blue eyes, then nodded slowly. "You smell nice, like cookies." Margaret's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Well, perhaps tomorrow we will make some cookies together. Would you like that?" Samuel nodded more enthusiastically, and Franklin felt a tiny bit of the tension in his chest ease. This might work. It had to work. The first week was an adjustment for everyone. Margaret moved through the house quietly, learning where everything was kept, observing the rhythms and routines of the family. She cooked meals that actually tasted like something other than ashes, did mountains of laundry that had been piling up for weeks, and managed to get Samuel to sleep through the night for the first time in months by rocking him in her chair and singing soft Irish lullabies her own mother had taught her. Emma remained wary, watching Margaret's every move with suspicious eyes. Franklin could see his daughter struggling between relief at having the burden lifted and resentment at this stranger stepping into her mother's kitchen. Margaret seemed to sense it too, and went out of her way to ask Emma's opinion on things, to not overstep the invisible boundaries Emma had drawn. One evening, about 10 days after Margaret's arrival, Franklin came in from the barn to find the kitchen transformed. The floor had been scrubbed, the windows washed until they sparkled, and the wonderful smell of roasting chicken filled the air. Margaret stood at the stove, her sleeves rolled up, hair escaping from its bun in damp tendrils from the steam. Emma was setting the table with the good china that hadn't been used since before Clara died, and the younger children were actually sitting quietly, drawn by the promise of a real meal. "I hope you do not mind that I used your mother's recipes," Margaret said to Emma as Franklin washed up at the basin. "I found her recipe book in the cupboard, and I thought the children might enjoy something familiar." Emma's face did something complicated, then she nodded. "Mama's chicken was always the best. I could never get it right." "You were doing wonderfully for someone your age," Margaret said firmly. "But some things just take practice and time. Perhaps you and I could cook together sometimes, and I could show you some of the tricks." That night, for the first time since Clara's death, the dinner table felt almost normal. The children chattered about their days. James reported on the new calf that had been born. Daniel demonstrated a trick he had taught the ranch dog, and even Emma laughed at something Rebecca said. Franklin found his eyes meeting Margaret's across the table, and something passed between them, a moment of shared understanding, of two people who had forgotten what it felt like to hear children laugh, and were quietly amazed to hear it again. After the children were in bed, Franklin found Margaret on the porch, sitting in her rocking chair and looking out at the stars. He hesitated, then sat on the porch railing nearby. "Thank you for today, for all of this. It has been a long time since this house felt like a home." "They are good children," Margaret said quietly. "It makes me think of what Emily would have been like if she had lived a few more years. She had Emma's seriousness sometimes, and Ruth's giggle, Daniel's energy." Her voice caught slightly. "What was she like? Your daughter?" Margaret was quiet for so long, Franklin thought she might not answer. Then she began to speak. "She loved stories. Every night she would beg for just one more tale, one more chapter. She wanted to be a teacher when she grew up. She would line up her dolls and teach them their letters." Margaret's hands tightened on the arms of the rocking chair. "The scarlet fever came on so fast. One day she was fine, the next she was burning up with fever. She lasted 4 days. At the end, she asked me why the angels were taking so long to come get her. She said she was tired of waiting." A tear slipped down Margaret's cheek. "I have never forgiven myself for not being able to save her, for not being able to do anything but watch her slip away." Franklin felt the words pulled from somewhere deep in his chest. "Thomas died in my arms. The horse had thrown him so hard that his spine was broken. He looked up at me and said he was sorry, like it was his fault, like he was apologizing for dying. He was gone in minutes. And then, Clara, she just gave up. I could see her making the choice to leave us, and I could not stop her. I have never felt so helpless in my entire life." They sat in the darkness, two damaged people who understood each other's pain in a way no one else could. It didn't make the hurt go away, but somehow it made it a little more bearable, knowing someone else carried a similar weight. The weeks passed, and autumn turned toward winter. The California winter was mild compared to the places Franklin had lived as a young man, but there was still a chill in the air and rain that turned the roads to mud. Margaret became a part of the household so seamlessly that within a month it was hard to remember what things had been like before her arrival. The house ran smoothly, the children were clean and fed, and slowly, gradually, the sharp edges of grief began to dull into something more manageable. Franklin found himself looking forward to the evenings, to the time after the children were in bed when he and Margaret would sit on the porch or by the fire and talk. She had a quiet intelligence, an interest in the world that Clara had lacked. Clara had been content with her home and family, but Margaret wanted to know about his cattle breeding program, about the politics of California statehood, about books she had read and ideas she had pondered. Their conversations ranged from the mundane to the philosophical, and Franklin realized he was talking more than he had in years. He also found himself noticing things about Margaret that had nothing to do with her capabilities as a housekeeper. The way the firelight brought out red glints in her auburn hair. The sound of her laugh, rare but genuine, when Daniel told an outrageous story. The competent way her hands moved as she mended a shirt or kneaded bread dough. The particular shade of her brown eyes, which changed color depending on the light. These thoughts made him feel guilty. Clara had been gone less than 3 months. How could he be noticing another woman already? But then he would catch Margaret looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, and his heart would do something complicated in his chest. Emma had finally warmed to Margaret after the older woman had sat up all night with Lucy. When the girl came down with a bad cough, never leaving her bedside, applying mustard plasters and spooning medicine into her with the fierce determination of someone who had lost one child and refused to lose another. When Lucy recovered, Emma had hugged Margaret for the first time, whispering, "Thank you for saving her," against her shoulder. After that, the last walls between them came down, and Emma began to seek Margaret out for advice on everything from how to style her hair to what to say to the boy from church who had started paying her attention. It was James who confronted Franklin, though, one December morning when they were out checking the fence line together. The boy had been quiet all morning, clearly working up to something, and finally he blurted out, "Are you going to marry Mrs. Murphy, Papa?" Franklin nearly dropped the fence wire he was holding. "What? James, what would make you ask that?" James's young face was serious. "I see how you look at her, and how she looks at you. It is the same way you and Mama used to look at each other when you thought we were not watching." Franklin didn't know what to say. "James, I loved your mother very much." "I know you did, Papa, but she is gone, and Mrs. Murphy is here, and I think maybe you could love her too. Would that be so bad? She makes you smile again. She makes all of us smile again." Out of the mouths of babes, Franklin thought. What would you think about that? If I did want to marry Mrs. Murphy? James considered this carefully. "I think Mama would want you to be happy. I think she would want all of us to be happy. And I like Mrs. Murphy. She is kind, and she does not try to be Mama. She is just herself. Plus, she makes much better biscuits than Emma ever did." This last was said with a hint of a grin, and Franklin found himself laughing. "Do not let your sister hear you say that." "I am not stupid, Papa." But James's words stayed with Franklin over the following days. He began to pay closer attention to his own feelings, to examine what Margaret had come to mean to him. She wasn't Clara, she would never be Clara, but she was becoming someone important in her own right, someone he looked forward to seeing every morning, someone whose opinion mattered to him, someone whose rare smiles felt like a gift. The realization that he was falling in love with her came quietly, without fanfare, on a rainy afternoon in mid-December. Margaret was in the kitchen teaching the twins how to make sugar cookies, flour dusting her apron and nose. Samuel was helping by eating more dough than he shaped. Emma and Lucy were rolling out dough while singing a carol, and Daniel was sneaking cookies off the cooling rack when he thought no one was looking. The house smelled of cinnamon and vanilla and sounded like a home should sound, full of life and warmth and laughter. Margaret looked up and caught Franklin watching from the doorway, and her face lit with a smile that made his heart skip a beat. In that moment, he knew he loved her. It was different from how he had loved Clara, less innocent, more complicated, built on shared grief and understanding rather than youthful passion. But it was real and deep and true. The question was, did she feel the same way? Christmas approached, and Margaret threw herself into preparations with an energy Franklin hadn't seen from her before. She enlisted the children in decorating the house with pine boughs and holly, made plans for a special dinner, and worked in secret on small gifts for each child. Franklin went into town and bought fabric for the girls, a new knife for James, a toy train for Samuel, and a leather-bound journal for Margaret that he saw her admiring in the store window one day. On Christmas Eve, after the children had finally settled down to sleep, their heads full of visions of what the morning might bring, Franklin found Margaret in the parlor, putting the finishing touches on small cloth dolls she had sewn for the twins. The firelight cast a warm glow over the room, and someone had left a sprig of mistletoe hanging in the doorway. "You have worked so hard to make this a good Christmas for them," Franklin said, settling into the chair across from her. "Thank you for that." Margaret smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. Last Christmas was when Emily got sick. She was so excited about the holiday, and then 3 days before Christmas, she woke up with the fever. By New Year's, she was gone. I never thought I would be able to face another Christmas without feeling like my heart was being ripped out. But you are facing it. Because of them. Because of your children, who have lost so much and are still trying to find joy in the world. They have reminded me that life continues even after loss, that it is possible to love again without betraying the memory of those we have lost. She looked up at him, and Franklin saw something vulnerable in her expression. "You have reminded me of that too, Franklin." He noticed she had used his first name, dropping the formal Mr. Carver she had maintained for weeks. "Margaret, I need to tell you something. These past months with you here, you have brought this family back to life. You have brought me back to life. I know it has not been long since Clara passed, and I know people might talk, but I find that I do not care what people think anymore. Life is too short and too precious to waste. I have come to care for you deeply, more than I probably should, more than I thought I could ever care for anyone again." Margaret had set down the doll, her hands trembling slightly. "Franklin, I am scared. I am scared to feel anything for anyone, because everyone I have ever loved has been taken from me. My parents died when I was young. My husband, Patrick, whatever we had between us, he is gone, and Emily losing her nearly destroyed me. What if I let myself love you and your children, and something terrible happens again?" Franklin moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her shaking hands in his. "Then we will face it together. Margaret, I cannot promise that nothing bad will ever happen. Life does not work that way, but I can promise that whatever comes, we will face it together. You will not have to bear anything alone ever again." "And neither will I." Tears were streaming down Margaret's face now. "I am falling in love with you. I think I have been for weeks, and it terrifies me. I am falling in love with you too, and it terrifies me as well. So let us be terrified together." Franklin reached up and gently wiped away her tears with his thumbs. "Margaret Murphy, I know this is fast and probably foolish, but would you consider becoming my wife? Would you consider making this family yours permanently, not just as a housekeeper, but as a mother to these children and a partner to me?" Margaret's breath caught, her eyes searching his face. "You really mean that? You want to marry me?" "I have never meant anything more in my life." "Then yes, Franklin, I will marry you." Franklin felt joy surge through him, bright and unexpected and wonderful. He stood, pulling Margaret up with him, and then they were in each other's arms, holding tight to this second chance neither of them had expected to find. When he kissed her, it was sweet and tender and full of promise, the kiss of two people who had been through darkness and found their way back to the light. They broke apart when they heard a sound from the doorway. Emma stood there in her nightgown, her eyes wide. For a moment, Franklin's heart stopped, afraid of how his daughter would react. Then Emma smiled, a real, genuine smile that made her look young again. "It is about time," she said. "James and I have had a bet going for the past 3 weeks about when you two would finally figure it out." "You have been betting on us?" Margaret asked, half laughing, half crying. "The whole household has been watching you make eyes at each other," Emma said, coming into the room. "We have all been hoping you would realize you belong together." She looked at Margaret seriously. "You are not replacing Mama. You could never replace her, but you have your own place with us now. And I think she would be happy knowing that Papa was not alone, that we all had someone to help us find our way again." Margaret opened her arms, and Emma went into them, and Franklin watched his daughter and his soon-to-be wife embrace, feeling his heart expand in a way he hadn't thought possible anymore. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, and the house erupted in excitement as the children discovered their presents. Franklin announced the engagement at breakfast, and there was a chorus of cheers from the younger children, a firm handshake from James, who looked pleased with himself, and happy tears from Lucy, who declared it was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. They were married in early January at the small church in San Diego, with all 7 children in attendance and half the town crowding in to witness. Margaret wore a simple dress of deep blue she refused to wear white for a second wedding, and carried wildflowers that the twins had helped her pick that morning. Franklin wore his best suit and could not stop smiling. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, he kissed his new bride to the sound of applause and the delighted giggles of his daughters. The months that followed were not without challenges. Blending a household was never easy, and there were still hard days when grief would rise up unexpectedly. Samuel would cry for his mother. Emma would find one of Clara's old dresses and spend an afternoon weeping. James would have nightmares about Thomas's accident. And both Franklin and Margaret would have moments when the losses they had suffered felt fresh and raw again. But they faced those moments together, supporting each other through the waves of sorrow, reminding each other that it was okay to grieve while still moving forward. Margaret never tried to erase Clara's memory from the house. She kept Clara's recipes, displayed a portrait of her in the parlor, and encouraged the children to talk about their mother and brother whenever they needed to. In turn, Franklin made sure Emily was remembered too, giving Margaret space to grieve her daughter, and even suggesting they plant a tree in the yard in Emily's memory. By spring, Margaret was pregnant, a development that surprised them both, given her age and the years of trying with Patrick that had resulted in only one child. She was nervous about it, afraid to hope, afraid to love another child who might be taken from her. Franklin held her through the anxious nights and reminded her that fear was no way to live. Their son was born in October of 1879, a healthy baby, with Franklin's dark hair and Margaret's brown eyes. They named him Patrick Thomas, honoring both the husband and the son they had lost. Samuel, now 4, was fascinated by his new baby brother and appointed himself the baby's protector. The twins cooed over him endlessly. Lucy and Daniel helped with feedings and diaper changes. Emma, at 15, was surprisingly good with the infant, and James carved a beautiful cradle that became a family treasure. Margaret cried when she first held Patrick Thomas, but they were tears of joy mixed with healing sorrow. "I never thought I would hold another baby," she whispered to Franklin. "I never thought I could feel this happy again." "Neither did I," Franklin admitted, looking at his wife and new son and feeling overwhelming gratitude for this second chance at building a family. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered under Franklin's management, and he was able to expand the herds and improve the breeding stock. Margaret proved to have a head for business and began keeping the books, her neat figures and careful management, helping them save money and plan for the future. Emma grew into a lovely young woman and at 18 married the son of a neighboring rancher, a good, steady young man who clearly adored her. Lucy showed such promise in mathematics that Franklin and Margaret arranged for her to attend a teaching college, where she thrived. James took over more and more of the ranch operations as he grew older, showing the same quiet competence that Thomas had possessed. Daniel, wild as ever, decided he wanted to be a veterinarian and apprenticed with the local animal doctor. The twins, impossible to tell apart even as they grew older, remained best friends and eventually married brothers from a family in town, shocking everyone by planning a double wedding. Samuel grew up barely remembering his birth mother, but loving Margaret fiercely as the only mother he really knew. And Patrick Thomas, their miracle baby, grew into a bright, curious boy who was utterly adored by all his older siblings. In 1882, Margaret gave birth to another child, a daughter they named Clara Emily, honoring both the wife and daughter they had lost. The birth was harder than Patrick's had been. Margaret was 40 by then, but both mother and daughter came through it healthy. Franklin held his tiny daughter and felt the circle closing, felt the healing that had begun years ago finally completing itself. Samuel, now 6, was initially jealous of the new baby getting so much attention, but Margaret made sure to spend special time with him each day, just the two of them. She would take him on walks around the ranch, letting him chatter about his day, teaching him the names of plants and birds, making him feel seen and valued. Patrick Thomas, at 2, was less concerned and mostly interested in whether the baby could play with him yet. Emma came to visit with her own newborn son, and the house was full of babies and laughter. Margaret held her grandson and looked around at the family that had grown around her, and Franklin saw the last shadows leave her eyes. She was home. They all were. The years continued to pass in the way years do when life is good too fast, each season blending into the next in a whirl of planting and harvesting, births and weddings, losses and gains. They lost Samuel to a fever when he was 8, a devastating blow that brought back all the old grief and reminded them how fragile life was. But this time, they weathered it together, the whole family pulling together to support each other through the sorrow. Margaret, though heartbroken, did not shatter the way she had when Emily died. She had learned that it was possible to survive loss, and she had a partner to lean on and children who needed her to be strong. Franklin's father back east passed away, leaving him a small inheritance that they used to expand the ranch further and build a larger house to accommodate their growing family. Lucy came home from teaching college with a degree and a fiancé, a fellow teacher who had no problem with having a wife smarter than himself. They settled in San Diego and had 3 children who spent their summers at the ranch, running wild with their younger aunt and uncles. Daniel finished his veterinary training and returned to set up a practice in San Diego, but he came out to the ranch several times a week to check on the animals and have dinner with his parents. The twins and their husbands bought property adjacent to the ranch, making the whole area feel like a family compound. James married at 25, a quiet girl from church who was perfect for him, and they built a house on the far side of the ranch. When James and his wife had their first child, a boy, Franklin held his grandson and thought about Thomas, about how proud his eldest son would have been to see how James had stepped up and become the man of the family in his absence. Patrick Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful young man who loved books almost as much as his sister, Clara Emily, loved horses. Clara Emily was a whirlwind from the moment she could walk, fearless and adventurous, with her father's determination and her mother's soft heart. She was the baby of the family and utterly spoiled by all her older siblings, but somehow she avoided being ruined by all the attention, remaining kind and thoughtful, even as she insisted on learning to rope cattle and break horses alongside the ranch hands. By 1895, Franklin was 59 years old and Margaret was 53. Their hair had gone gray, their bodies moved a little slower, but they were happy in a way neither had ever imagined possible during those dark days of 1878. They sat on the porch one evening, the California sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, watching Patrick Thomas chase Clara Emily around the yard, while the ranch dogs barked joyfully. "Do you ever think about how we met?" Margaret asked, her hand warm in Franklin's. "About how broken we both were?" "Every day," Franklin admitted. "And every day I am grateful that I happened to be in town that particular morning, that I heard you arguing with Henderson, that I had the courage to speak to you instead of minding my own business. I was so lost," Margaret said softly. "I truly did not know how I was going to go on, and then you offered me this lifeline, this family, this home. You saved me, Franklin." "We saved each other," Franklin corrected. "You gave me a reason to keep going, a reason to remember how to live instead of just existing. You brought light back into this house and into my heart." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. "We have been blessed, not just with surviving our losses, but with finding each other afterward, with building something beautiful out of our grief. 7 children I had, and you had none," Franklin mused. "And together we made a family that held us all. Emma, James, Lucy, Daniel, Ruth, Rebecca, and Samuel. They all gained a mother when they needed one most. Patrick and Clara, Emily gained life itself, and I gained a partner I cherish more than I can say. I gained 7 children I love as dearly as if I had birthed them myself," Margaret said, "and 2 more who I did birth, and a husband who showed me that it was possible to love again after loss, that the heart has infinite capacity if we are brave enough to open it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their youngest children play, thinking about the ones who were scattered around California with families of their own, remembering the ones who were gone but never forgotten. The ranch stretched out around them, golden grass waving in the evening breeze, cattle lowing in the distance, the Pacific Ocean a blue line on the western horizon. "Do you think Clara would have approved of us?" Margaret asked suddenly. "Do you think she would have wanted this for you and the children?" Franklin considered the question seriously. "I think Clara loved her children more than anything in the world, and I think she would have wanted them to be happy, to be cared for, to grow up in a home full of love. So yes, I think she would have approved. I think she would have been grateful to you for giving them what she could not. And Patrick, though he and I were not as happy as you and Clara were, I think he would have wanted me to find happiness, to find a family to love. He always knew I wanted more children, and he grieved with me every time I lost a baby before Emily. He would be glad to know I finally got the large family I always dreamed of. And Emily," Franklin said gently, "what do you think she would say?" Margaret smiled through sudden tears. "I think she would have loved having brothers and sisters. She was always begging us for siblings, and I think she would have loved this ranch, the horses, the wide open spaces. She would have been best friends with Clara Emily, I think. They have the same spirit." "She is never forgotten," Franklin said firmly. "None of them are. Thomas, Clara, Emily, Samuel, they are all part of this family still. We carry them with us." "We do," Margaret agreed. "And I think they would all be proud of what we have built here, of how we have loved each other and honored their memories while still moving forward with our lives." Patrick Thomas caught his sister, and they both tumbled to the ground in a heap, laughing. Margaret called out that it was time to come in for supper, and the children ran toward the house, the dogs at their heels. Emma and her family would be arriving tomorrow for Sunday dinner. James and his wife and children would come over after church. The twins had promised to bring their famous apple pies. Lucy and her family were coming down from San Diego for the week. Daniel had the day off and would be there with his new sweetheart, a pretty girl who worked at the telegraph office. The house would be full of noise and chaos and love, exactly as it should be. Margaret went inside to start final preparations for the meal, and Franklin sat for a moment longer, thinking about the journey that had brought them here, the grief that had nearly destroyed them both, the chance meeting that had changed everything, the slow, careful process of learning to trust again, to hope again, to love again. Life had taught him that happiness was never guaranteed, that loss was an inevitable part of the human experience. But it had also taught him that the capacity to heal was stronger than he had ever imagined, that love could spring up in the most unexpected places, and that family was not just about blood, but about the choice to show up for each other, day after day, through joy and sorrow alike. He thought about that desperate man standing at his kitchen window 17 years ago, watching his children struggle and not knowing how they would survive. He wished he could go back and tell that man that it would be okay, that help was coming, that he would find love again and his children would thrive and life would become sweet again, even after the bitterest sorrow. But that man would not have believed him. Some things you had to live through to understand. Franklin stood and stretched, feeling the pleasant ache of muscles well used from a day of hard work. He could hear Margaret singing in the kitchen, could hear Patrick and Clara Emily arguing cheerfully about whose turn it was to set the table. He could smell pot roast and fresh bread. Through the window he could see the barn, where James would arrive tomorrow, the fields where Daniel had helped deliver a calf last week, the road that Emma would travel down with her family in the morning. This was home. This was family. This was the life they had built together out of grief and loss and the courage to try again. It wasn't perfect, no life ever was. There had been struggles and disappointments along with the joys, but it was theirs, earned through hard work and maintained with love, and Franklin treasured every single imperfect, precious moment of it. He went inside to wash up for supper, dropping a kiss on Margaret's cheek as he passed. She smiled at him, that special smile reserved just for him, and he felt his heart swell with gratitude. They had been given a second chance, and they had not wasted it. They had honored those they had lost by living fully, by loving deeply, by building a family that would carry forward long after they were gone. Later that night, after the children were in bed, Franklin and Margaret stood in the doorway of Clara Emily's room, watching their daughter sleep. At 13, she was starting to show signs of the beauty she would become, but right now she was still their little girl, her hair tangled on the pillow, one arm thrown over her head in careless sleep. "She looks like you when she sleeps," Margaret whispered, that same peaceful expression. "She has your spirit, though, fierce and determined and full of fire." They moved to Patrick's room next. At 15, he was gangly and awkward, all long limbs and big feet he hadn't quite grown into yet. But he had a good heart and a sharp mind, and Franklin was proud of the young man he was becoming. "Do you remember when he was born?" Margaret asked softly. "How terrified I was. I remember. And I remember how you cried when you first held him, like you were afraid he might disappear if you blinked. I was afraid. I was so afraid to love him, because I had lost so much already. But you taught me that fear was no way to live, that love was always worth the risk." Franklin pulled her close, and they stood together in the dim hallway of their home, thinking about all the rooms that had held all their children over the years. Emma's old room, now a guest room that would hold her children tomorrow. The room the twins had shared until they married. Samuel's room, left mostly as it was, with his toy soldiers still arranged on the shelf. The room that had briefly held Thomas before he had moved to the bunkhouse with the ranch hands, eager to be treated as a man. "We have lived a good life," Franklin said. "Whatever happens from here, we have lived a very good life." "We have," Margaret agreed. "And we still have years ahead of us, God willing. Years to watch these children grow, to meet more grandchildren, to grow old together." "I am already old," Franklin teased, and Margaret elbowed him gently. "You are distinguished. There is a difference." They made their way to their own room, the large bedroom at the end of the hall that looked out over the ranch lands. Franklin had built Margaret a window seat there, where she liked to sit in the mornings with her coffee and watch the sunrise. The room held their shared life, the bed they slept in each night, the dresser that held both their clothes, the photographs on the wall documenting their years together. As they prepared for bed, moving through the familiar rituals of a long marriage, Franklin thought about how grateful he was for every day. Not just the good days, but even the hard ones, because they had faced them together. Margaret caught him watching her as she brushed her hair, and she raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking about with that look on your face?" "I am thinking about how much I love you, about how glad I am that I went to town that particular day in November all those years ago, about how you have made my life immeasurably richer and better." Margaret set down her brush and came to him, cupping his weathered face in her hands. "And I am thinking about how you gave me a reason to live when I had none, how you showed me that it was possible to build something beautiful out of broken pieces, how you loved me even when I was not sure I could love anyone ever again." They kissed, soft and sweet, a kiss that spoke of years of companionship and understanding and love that had weathered every storm. When they finally settled into bed, Margaret curled against Franklin's side the way she did every night, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "Franklin," she murmured sleepily. "Yes, love? Thank you for choosing me, for asking me to stay, for loving me and my grief and all my broken pieces. Thank you for saying yes, for loving my children, for being brave enough to try again." They fell asleep like that, two people who had found each other in the darkest time of their lives and built something lasting and true. Outside, the California night was still and peaceful, stars scattered across the black velvet sky. The ranch slept around them, the cattle bedded down, the horses quiet in the barn, the dogs curled up on the porch. The years continued their steady march. Patrick Thomas went off to university in San Francisco, the first of Franklin's children, to pursue higher education beyond Lucy. He studied literature and history and came home speaking passionately about social reform and the rights of workers. Franklin didn't always agree with his son's politics, but he was proud that the boy thought deeply about the world and his place in it. Clara Emily, true to her nature, refused all attempts to send her to finishing school and instead insisted on staying at the ranch and learning the cattle business from her father. At 16, she could ride better than most of the ranch hands, could deliver a calf, mend a fence, and manage the books when Margaret needed help. She was courted by half the young men in the county, but she turned them all down, declaring that she had no interest in being anyone's wife when she had a ranch to help run. "She is going to end up a spinster if she keeps this up," Emma fretted during one Sunday dinner. Emma had 4 children now and couldn't imagine a life that didn't revolve around family. "She is going to end up happy," Margaret corrected firmly. "Let her find her own path. Not every woman needs to marry young. Not every woman needs to marry at all." Franklin hid a smile. His wife had progressive ideas that sometimes shocked their more traditional neighbors, but he loved that about her. She had raised daughters who knew their own minds and sons who respected women as equals. It was not always easy going against the grain of society's expectations, but Franklin had never been one to care much what other people thought. When Clara Emily was 18, a young man came to work at the ranch, the son of a horse breeder from Kentucky, who was looking to learn the California ranching methods. His name was Robert, and unlike the other young men who had courted Clara Emily with flattery and promises, he treated her as an equal. He asked her advice on handling the horses, listened when she talked about breeding programs, and challenged her ideas with respect rather than dismissal. Franklin watched them fall in love over the course of that summer, working side by side in the dusty corrals, their conversations ranging from horses to books to dreams for the future. Robert made Clara Emily laugh, but more importantly, he made her think. And Clara Emily brought out a gentleness in Robert that his rough exterior hid. When Robert asked Franklin for permission to marry Clara Emily, he was careful to note that he understood his future wife would want to remain involved in the ranch, that he had no intention of taking her away or making her into a traditional housewife. Franklin gave his blessing gladly, seeing in this young man someone who would truly partner with his daughter rather than trying to control her. They were married in the fall of 1898, a beautiful outdoor ceremony at the ranch with all the family in attendance. Margaret cried happy tears as she watched her youngest daughter marry, and Franklin held her hand through the ceremony, remembering their own wedding 20 years before, how far they had come since those grief-stricken days, how much they had built together. Patrick Thomas surprised everyone by falling in love with a fellow student at university, a woman studying to be a doctor, and announcing his engagement just 6 months after Clara Emily's wedding. The girl, whose name was Sarah, came from a progressive family in San Francisco and was everything Patrick needed: intelligent, driven, passionate about social causes, and utterly devoted to him. Franklin and Margaret made the journey to San Francisco for the wedding, a small affair in a garden surrounded by the couple's friends from university. By 1900, Franklin was 64 and Margaret was 58. They had slowed down considerably, leaving most of the ranch operations to James and Clara, Emily and Robert, though Franklin still made his rounds every day and Margaret still managed the household with the help of a younger woman from town. They had 11 grandchildren with more on the way, and the ranch had expanded to become one of the most successful operations in Southern California. They celebrated the new century with a massive party at the ranch. All their children and grandchildren gathered together, plus friends and neighbors from miles around. As Franklin looked around at the crowd, at the family he and Margaret had built together, he felt overwhelming gratitude. They had taken broken pieces 7 grieving children, 2 grieving adults, and created something whole and beautiful. "What are you thinking?" Margaret asked, appearing at his side with 2 glasses of punch. "I am thinking about how blessed we have been, about how we could have let grief destroy us, but instead we found each other and built all this." He gestured at the crowd, at their children and grandchildren playing and laughing and living. Margaret's eyes were misty. "We honored them, didn't we? Thomas and Clara and Emily and Samuel. We honored them by living fully, by loving deeply, by creating more love in the world rather than letting loss make us bitter." "We did," Franklin agreed, "and I think they would be proud of what we have built, of the family we have become." They stood together watching the party, 2 people who had found each other in grief and built a life in joy. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. Children ran shrieking across the lawn, playing tag while their parents visited and laughed. Music drifted from where someone had set up a fiddle, and couples were beginning to dance. Emma appeared with her eldest son, now a strapping young man of 18. "Papa, Mama Margaret, Samuel wants to ask you something." The family had settled on calling Margaret Mama Margaret to distinguish her from Emma's memories of Mama Clara, and Margaret had been moved to tears the first time Emma had used the term. Young Samuel, named for his uncle who had died before he was born, looked nervous. "Grandfather, Grandmother, I have decided I want to study medicine. I want to go to university back east. I was hoping you might write me a letter of recommendation." Franklin felt pride swell in his chest. "Of course I will, son. Your Uncle Daniel will be glad to know another member of the family is going into healing work." The party continued late into the night, and when it finally wound down and the last guests had departed, Franklin and Margaret sat on their porch watching the stars come out. The house behind them was full of sleeping grandchildren and their parents, every bed full, people camping out on floors and sofas, the whole place bursting with family. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day in town?" Margaret asked quietly. "You said we could help each other. 2 people who understood what it was to lose the most precious thing in the world. I remember. I was so desperate that day, so lost. I saw you and recognized a kindred spirit, someone else who was drowning in grief. And you threw me a lifeline. You gave me 7 children to love when I had none. You gave me purpose and family, and eventually love. You gave me everything, Franklin." "We gave each other everything," Franklin corrected. "You saved my children by giving them a mother when they desperately needed one. You saved me by reminding me that life could still hold beauty and joy. We saved each other, Margaret. That is the truth of it." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind through the grass. Inside the house, someone cried out in their sleep and was comforted by their parent. A baby fussed and was soothed. Life continued its eternal rhythm, generations flowing into each other, grief and joy intermingled, love the constant thread running through it all. "I would do it all again," Margaret said suddenly. "Even knowing about Emily, about losing her, I would do it all again because it led me here, to you, to this family, to this life. The grief was worth it because it brought me to this place of joy." Franklin pulled her close, kissing her silvered hair. "I would do it all again, too. I would grieve Thomas and Clara 1,000 times if it meant finding you at the end of that dark road. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Margaret Carver. And you are the best thing that ever happened to me, Franklin Carver." They went inside finally, making their way carefully through the house, full of sleeping family. In their room, they prepared for bed with the ease of long practice, moving around each other in comfortable synchronicity. As they settled under the covers, Margaret curled against Franklin's side, the way she had every night for more than 20 years. "Do you think we will have many more years together?" Margaret asked softly, voicing the fear that came with age, the knowledge that their time was more limited now than it had been. "I hope so," Franklin said honestly. "But however long we have, I will treasure every single day. Every morning I wake up next to you is a gift I never expected to receive." "Promise me something," Margaret said. "If I go first, promise me you will not shut down like Clara did. Promise me you will stay for the children and grandchildren, that you will keep living. Only if you promise me the same thing. If I go first, you keep going. You stay for all of them. They need you." "I promise," Margaret whispered. "I promise I will stay. I am not that broken woman you found in San Diego anymore. You taught me how to be strong, how to survive loss and keep going. I will not forget those lessons. And I promise, too, I will stay. I will keep going. For them, and in honor of you." They sealed their promises with a kiss and fell asleep holding hands. Two people who had found each other in the wreckage of grief and built a family that would endure long after they were gone. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, and the ranch slept peacefully beneath the California sky, full of life and love and the promise of tomorrows yet to come. The years that remained to them were good ones, though not without their sorrows. They lost James to a sudden heart attack when he was only 50, a devastating blow that reminded them all how fragile life was. But the family rallied around his widow and children, and Franklin and Margaret grieved together, drawing strength from each other as they had learned to do. Daniel's wife died in childbirth, leaving him a widower with 3 young children, and Margaret stepped in to help care for them until Daniel could find his footing again. But there were joys too. More grandchildren were born, and then great-grandchildren. Patrick Thomas published a book about labor reform that garnered some attention back east. Clara, Emily, and Robert expanded the ranch further and developed a breeding program for horses that became renowned throughout California. The twins remained inseparable even as grandmothers, their children growing up as close as siblings. Lucy became a headmistress of a girls' school in San Diego and never stopped advocating for women's education. Emma had 8 children total and more than 20 grandchildren, her house always full of noise and laughter. Daniel eventually remarried, a kind widow who loved his children as her own, and gave him 3 more babies before declaring they were done. Franklin and Margaret made it to their 30th anniversary in 1909, a milestone they celebrated surrounded by what seemed like half of Southern California, their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, nieces, nephews, friends, neighbors, ranch hands past and present. The party was even bigger than the turn-of-the-century celebration, and Franklin looked around in amazement at what they had created. 2 broken people had come together, and from their union had sprung this enormous, thriving family tree. 30 years, Margaret marveled as they danced together, moving slowly in deference to their aging bodies. 30 years of marriage, and I love you more now than I did on our wedding day. That is because our love had to grow, Franklin said. It started small, tentative, built on grief and understanding, but it has deepened into something stronger than steel, something that has weathered every storm. I love you more than words can express, Margaret. And I love you, Franklin. Thank you for 30 years of partnership, of love, of building a family together. Thank you for every day. Franklin passed peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1911 at the age of 75. He went to bed after a good day working on the ranch with Clara, Emily, and Robert, ate a hearty supper surrounded by family, kissed his wife goodnight, and simply did not wake up in the morning. Margaret found him looking peaceful, as though he had just slipped from one form of sleep into another. And though her heart broke to lose him, she was grateful he had not suffered. She kept her promise to him. Though grief tried to pull her under, she refused to let it win. She stayed for the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who needed her. She stayed for Franklin, to honor the life they had built together. She stayed because 30-plus years of marriage to a good man had taught her that life was precious and should be lived fully until the very last moment. Margaret lived another 7 years, remaining active in the ranch operations and family life until the very end. She passed away in 1918 at the age of 76, surrounded by her children, all of Franklin's children, who had become her children too. With her last breaths, she told them she loved them, that she was proud of the people they had become, and that she was ready to go be with Franklin again. They buried her next to Franklin under the oak tree on the hill overlooking the ranch, with Thomas on Franklin's other side and Clara next to Margaret. The family had added 2 more stones over the years, one for Emily, Margaret's daughter, who had never seen the ranch but was part of the family nonetheless, and one for Samuel, the little boy who had brought Franklin and Margaret together in those early days by clinging to Margaret's skirt and hoping for cookies. At the funeral, Patrick Thomas, now a distinguished professor at 40, gave the eulogy. He spoke of how his father had grieved his son with 7 kids left, how Margaret had grieved her daughter with none, and how together they had become a family. He talked about the courage it took to love again after devastating loss, about the strength required to build something new out of broken pieces. He honored both his birth mother Clara, who he barely remembered, but who had given him life, and his mama Margaret, who had raised him and loved him and taught him what it meant to be resilient. They showed us that family is not just about blood, Patrick Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. It is about choice. It is about showing up day after day, through grief and joy, through hard times and good. They chose each other when they were both broken, and in choosing each other, they healed themselves and all of us. They built a legacy of love that will endure for generations. We are all here children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, because 2 grieving people had the courage to try again, to love again, to build a family out of loss. Clara Emily stood next to her brother, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the crowd gathered to honor their parents. There were easily 200 people present, most of them family, the 7 original children, all grown now with silver in their hair and grandchildren of their own. Patrick Thomas and Clara Emily, the children of Franklin and Margaret's union. Dozens of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a living testament to the family that had been built on a foundation of grief transformed into love. After the service, the family gathered at the ranch house for a meal, the way they always did for important occasions. The house that Franklin had built and Margaret had made a home was now overseen by Clara Emily and Robert, but it still held the spirits of those who had loved it first. Clara's recipes were still used in the kitchen. Franklin's rocking chair still sat on the porch. Margaret's garden still bloomed with the flowers she had planted. Emma, now 65, and a great-grandmother many times over, stood and raised a glass. "To Franklin and Margaret," she said, her voice carrying through the crowded room. "They gave us back our family when we thought it was broken forever. They taught us how to grieve without drowning, how to honor those we have lost while still embracing life. They showed us that love is always worth the risk, always worth the pain, because love is what makes us human. They are together now, reunited, watching over all of us, and we are their legacy, all of us, this entire family that might never have existed if 2 broken people had not found each other in San Diego all those years ago." "To Franklin and Margaret," the room chorused, glasses raised, tears flowing freely, hearts full of love and grief and gratitude all tangled together in the complicated way of family. Later, as the sun set over the ranch in shades of gold and rose, Clara Emily walked up the hill to the cemetery plot under the oak tree. She sat between her parents' graves, her hand on each headstone, and talked to them the way she had when they were alive. She told them about the new foals that had been born, about her children and grandchildren, about how the ranch was thriving. She told them she missed them terribly but was grateful for every year she had gotten with them. She told them their love story had been an inspiration, a reminder that it was never too late for happiness, never too late to build something beautiful. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Clara Emily stood and brushed off her skirt. She walked back down the hill toward the ranch house, where lights glowed warm in the windows and family waited inside. Behind her, on the hill, 6 graves sat in peaceful witness: Thomas, Clara, Franklin, Margaret, Emily, and Samuel. 3 had been born to this family, 3 had joined it by choice or chance, but all were equal in death as they had been in life. All were part of the story, the great sprawling story of a family built on grief and love, loss and hope, endings and new beginnings. The ranch would continue for generations, passed down through the family, a living monument to 2 people who had found each other when they needed it most. The story of Franklin and Margaret would be told and retold to children and grandchildren yet unborn, a family legend about courage and resilience and the transformative power of love. They had grieved, oh, how they had grieved, but they had not let grief have the final word. Instead, they had chosen life, chosen love, chosen family. And in that choice, they had created something that would endure long after they were gone, a legacy measured not in land or money, but in the descendants who carried their love forward into the future, generation after generation, world without end.